This episode is brought to you by my Fertility Management Masterclass. Master fertility awareness and improve your menstrual cycle health at the same time. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workwithme for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/workwithme. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 126. Welcome to the 126th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. Before we get into today's interview, I just wanted to take a moment and share with you some updates. I know some of you have been patiently waiting to find out when I'll be offering the next round of Fertility Friday group programs. And so I'm super excited to be offering the next round of group programs starting in April of this year. So basically a month from now. And so if you're listening in real time and you want to make sure that you're part of the next round of groups, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program, just so that you know I do have several applications already and I'm only able to hold so many women. So I actually have a few spots filled already. So if you're wanting to make sure that you have a place in there, don't delay, don't hesitate, make sure to jump on that right away. And a few things that I want to share with you. So currently I have 2 groups going. I have my birth control group, women who are primarily focused on avoiding pregnancy for now. And I have a separate group for women who are working on conceiving. So at different points of their journey, some of the women in the group are actively trying to conceive while others are doing preconception care and really just wanting to get a handle on their cycles before they're starting to try to conceive. And it's just been an amazing experience for so many different reasons. One of my favorite things about doing a group setting is that not only do you get to learn all about fertility awareness, and not only are we really delving into it really deeply, but you're also able to learn from and experience what all of the other members of the group are experiencing. So when you're mixed in with 6 to 8 women who are also at varying stages of their own fertility journey and different ages, you're really able to be exposed to all these different scenarios, situations, and discussions and conversations that you otherwise wouldn't have. So I find that there's kind of a 2-part learning going on. One of the pieces is the fertility awareness, all the nitty-gritty, but the other is what you're able to learn from each other. And the supportive environment that's created within these groups is incredible as well. An environment where there's no silly questions. All questions are okay. And, there's really nothing that's off the table in terms of discussion. And I feel like it's a really unique opportunity. I don't really know how many other environments in the world offer this type of specialized care. And I mean, from another perspective, especially from my birth control group, who are focused primarily on avoiding pregnancy, I've gotten a collective sigh of relief, that this method is really easy to follow. It's very cut and dry. There's no gray area. It's very clear as to which days are fertile, which days are not, how to manage the fertile window, and what to do when in doubt, and also just really figuring out what all the different mucus observations mean. So even in a cycle that's really challenging, where your mucus observations, you feel like you can't really interpret what's going on, the method that I teach allows you to figure all of that out with a little bit of support. So I really hope to see you in the group programs. I did want to take some time and share with you all about them. And I'll be talking more about the group programs over the next month, just to give you a closer idea, more of an in-depth idea of what to expect. So without further ado, I'm going to hop into this week's interview. And today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Lily Nichols, back to the show. Lily has been on the show a number of times, so make sure to check out the show notes page and listen to our previous interviews. We've covered a lot of ground so far. We've talked about gestational diabetes. That was a great episode. Exercise during pregnancy. Most recently, a real food diet for PCOS, which is another excellent one to make sure to listen to. And in today's show, we're going to be talking about breastfeeding nutrition. Lily is a registered dietitian and nutritionist, a certified diabetes educator, and a certified Pilates instructor. She's also a researcher, speaker, and author with a passion for evidence-based prenatal nutrition, with a unique specialization in gestational diabetes. And what I love about her work is that she utilizes a real food approach in her client work. And she is my first guest to be featured on the podcast 4 times. So obviously, I love picking her brain. So welcome back to the show, Lily.
Hey, 4 times the charm, I guess, huh?
Totally.
That's
and you're
awesome.
coming back again, which is also awesome. So
yes.
And what I love too is that every time you come back, we cover a completely different topic. I mean, of course, there's common threads because we're talking about nutrition, but each episode is completely different than the other one. So love having you on the show.
Thank you. I love being on it.
Well, and I'll spare the guests an intro because you've done it several times. I thought I'd ask you kind of a different question, though, just to get our feet wet and to give the guests who have never heard an interview with you before a little bit of background. I just wanted to ask you about, I guess, what you've been doing in terms of promoting your book and some of the speaking engagements that you've done recently.
Oh, well, sure. Yeah, happy to talk about that. I have to say, I've been, how was I describing this to a friend the other day? I'm like taking the slow train this year. So I released the book in 2015 and did several dozen interviews and a bunch of speaking engagements. And then I got pregnant and had a baby this spring. So I've been obviously had my hands full with that. But I did speak at the PaleoFX conference this year on the topic of pregnancy and carbohydrates. My lecture was called The Carbohydrate and Pregnancy Controversy. So going into all this like nitty gritty research about, just how the evidence weighs in on whether it supports the conventional approach, which is a fairly high carbohydrate diet during pregnancy, or looking at things more through an ancestral lens and thinking about what traditional cultures ate and their carbohydrate levels and how that varies around the globe and how that impacts pregnancy and what's safe and what's not. So that was a really fun speaking engagement. Kind of crazy because I was traveling with a pretty new baby. So I was like, speaking of the topic we're going to talk about today, I was less present at the conference because I was back and forth breastfeeding so much. Baby decided he didn't want to take a bottle very often when I was gone, a bottle of my pumped breast milk. So I was just going back and forth to be mobile milk unit, which is the nickname I gave myself early on. But yeah, it's been a busy year.
Yeah, for sure. And I should have mentioned to you, but so we're recording this super early. I'm releasing this episode actually February 2017. So the listeners, by the time they are listening to this, when you say last year, the conference Lily was attending was in 2016, just to give a little bit of background there. And the book is Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. So you'll find the link for that in the show notes page as well. But to orient ourselves to the topic of the day, I wanted to get us started, to kind of get the audience thinking about what breastfeeding is like. And so maybe you could just kind of introduce us to that a little bit. What happens to the body during breastfeeding, and how do the nutritional requirements of a breastfeeding mother change, or how do they differ from the nutritional requirements of a woman in pregnancy, or even just before she's even pregnant?
Sure. Yeah. I feel like the transition from like being not pregnant to pregnant is like kind of crazy, but you ease into it a little bit. And then the transition from being pregnant to having a new baby is like, what just happened to me?
like a crash. Like what just totally happened?
Like, I don't want to say it's a train wreck, but like in some ways it's a train wreck. Some ways it's like the most amazing thing in the world, but your world is it's just flipped upside down so quickly. And nutritionally as well, because during pregnancy, our nutrient needs are higher. If we're just looking purely through a conventional lens, like how much more nutrition you need during pregnancy, it's arguable, but maybe about 300 calories extra per day. During breastfeeding, you need even more. You need about 500 calories more compared to when you're not pregnant. So it takes a lot of energy to make breast milk. And I felt like, if I just want to share a little personal story, I felt like in the first week or two, probably even the first month, gosh, although it's all blurry when you look back at that stuff, right? Sleep deprivation does crazy things to your memory.
It's all like a big blur.
Yeah. I was so hungry, like so incredibly hungry. And I feel like, when you combine the demand on your body that labor is, and then, usually no matter what, even if you don't have tears, there's like tissue damage and inflammation, and like the uterus is shrinking down. There's all these change is happening really rapidly. The breast tissue is changing as all these lactation hormones are kicking in. And I felt like I needed 4 times the amount of nutrition that I had during pregnancy. It was just, I was so hungry. My husband brought me breakfast like the first day, and it was like, something that I would normally have for breakfast. I was like, yeah, so I'm going to need about quadruple that amount of food from now on. Thank you very much. Like, you just need a lot of energy to produce breast milk and to heal from everything that your body has been through. So that's like the short end of the story. The longer end of the story is there's actually certain nutrient needs that go up while you're breastfeeding in order to make your breast milk as nutritious as possible and give baby all the nutrients that he or she requires.
Well, totally. And I can completely relate to that sentiment of being really hungry. I remember after giving birth to my eldest son, it was like I would go from 0 to 10, like instantly. Like I would be okay. And then all of a sudden I would like need to eat half of an animal. Like it was just so, so jarring, like so ridiculous. And it was like an emergency. Like it was like I needed to, like I remember afterwards, it was my husband who was making sure that I ate. So he was kind of taking care of that. But if I didn't have him there, it would have been a huge problem because it was literally like an emergency to take care of that. I felt a lot more
like
prepared for the second
kicks
baby.
in seconds. And part of it, I think, is also like you're so like distracted with caring for a baby that you aren't able to be as mindful of your hunger cues, like to catch yourself when you're like early in the hungry stage rather than like you kind of push things off. I mean, sometimes you're just stuck on the couch nursing the baby that, you'll be like, oh gosh, I really need to pee. And I guess I haven't peed in a couple hours. Jeez, it's like it just creeps up on you because you're so distracted.
Well, for sure. And so then just given how incredibly hungry that I was, I think with the first pregnancy, I probably wasn't always reaching for the best options. I felt a little bit more prepared with my second. So I had things on hand. I think I mentioned to you in one of our post chats that as soon as I kind of went into labor with my youngest son, I threw on like some bones in the crock pot so that in the morning after I'd given birth, I would have this lovely, warm, delicious bone broth, I don't know, comfort food type thing. That's also super nutrient dense, but that's not something that I was even on my radar in my first pregnancy. So maybe you could talk just a little bit about then what happens to women when they're not, let's say, prepared for it, and then how can eating crap because you're so hungry, how that can affect the quality of your breast milk.
Yeah. Well, like we were chatting about before we started recording here, like I was saying, it's been a bit taboo to discuss breastfeeding nutrition in terms of how diet quality impacts breast milk because there are just so many barriers to breastfeeding. And even if you're like so gung-ho about breastfeeding, there are going to be so many little thoughts that niggle into your brain that make you question if everything's going well, right? And so sometimes if we get too concerned about eating, always making the best choices possible with eating and trying to be like super, super healthy or super strict paleo or super strict whatever, and think that our breast milk isn't good because we had a cookie or something like that, then that kind of creates this whole downward spiral thing. So I don't want to get us into that realm because you just have to eat, period, no matter what it is. But being prepared with healthier options is going to go a long way because when you're, like I said, stuck on the couch with a newborn and you can't even get 5 minutes to yourself without being interrupted, you can't eat with both hands, you need to have things that are convenient and easy, and you most definitely need people to help you out and bring you some food. So you don't have to be the one cooking. I mean, I think it would be literally impossible to try to cook while caring for a newborn in those really, really early stages. But there are some things that do impact the quality of the breast milk that I think are important to touch upon, because I get a little bit frustrated when people go on the opposite extreme where it doesn't matter what you eat when you're breastfeeding because breast is always best and your body is going to take what it needs from your body to provide for the baby, just like they tell you during pregnancy, which is true, but then you're going to be really depleted nutritionally. Like if you've had a whole pregnancy where you're not eating well, or maybe you came into pregnancy with poor nutrient stores and now you've gone through these 9 months, now you're breastfeeding. It's like, what's going to be left for you, you know? Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of women that get really nutritionally depleted during breastfeeding. So not only do we want to think about, the quality of milk for baby, but you want to just take care of yourself so your body can heal and repair, and you can kind of figure out your new normal, because it's just growing and feeding a baby is like a huge responsibility, and it's a huge drain on your body, if I'm totally honest. So some of the things that I think are important to keep in mind is that the type of fats that you eat. So we've talked enough about food quality that probably the listeners here are already going to know what I'm about to say, but trans fats, which are a type of fat that is artificially hardened, so they take a liquid vegetable oil, put it through a process called partial hydrogenation to turn it into a solid fat. And this is used in a lot of processed foods, although now it's becoming less and less prevalent now that they require labeling on trans fats. But that specific fat is known to cross into breast milk and takes the place of healthy saturated fat, and can even negatively impact brain and vision development of your baby. Human babies are born with very immature brains. So a lot of their development happens after the fact. So you want to make sure that you're not putting in bad fats in their diet. And I'm talking specifically about trans fats. So you just want to look at any food products you're buying. Say if you are going to have a cookie, which I'm not opposed to, by the way, like you got to eat all the food while you're breastfeeding. Make sure that the fat that's used in it is not partially hydrogenated whatever oil, partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, partially hydrogenated soybean oil. That's where there's going to be trans fats hiding. And of all the food products that are still including trans fats, I find that things like cookies and donuts and some of these baked goods are some of the more common ones, especially like the grocery store brand ones, like the grocery store bakery cookies that come in a little, plastic clamshell package. Like those ones always seem to be made with the most junk for whatever reason. So, go for somebody's homemade cookies and maybe ditch some of the store-bought ones if they're made with bad fats. If, on the other hand, having a cookie that is made with real butter is going to be actually pretty good for you, because the more fat that you include in your diet, your breast milk actually gets a little bit fattier too. And that's very nourishing to baby. And real butter, especially when it's from pasture raised or grass fed cows, it has higher levels of fat soluble vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, and K, which are really important for growth and development of your baby as well. So, right there is an example of kind of the intricacies of this. It's not just black and white, like cookies are bad, junk food's bad, but maybe the ingredients that go into whatever products you're eating are important. So maybe that kind of gives us an in on my stance on breastfeeding nutrition. We can go from here.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on the composition of breast milk, and I'd love for you to go into that a little bit further. I think just as a mom who has, if you add up the time that I breastfed, I guess it would add up to about 3.5 years at this point that I've at some point been breastfeeding one or the other child.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that given that kind of duration of time, and breast milk changes, and I think that, unless you've looked into it and read about it and taken an interest in it, you wouldn't necessarily know that. So it's really interesting. Breast milk changes from when you have a newborn to when your child is 6 months old to when they're a year or 18 months. And then if you breastfeed longer, it continues to change to meet the requirements of your child at that particular age, which is really interesting. And so over the past almost 4 years, my diet has changed somewhat. And so I can speak to the way that my milk looks. It actually looked a lot different when I wasn't eating a diet that was kind of more heavy on the fats, the healthy fats. And so now, I mean, I don't have a whole lot of time to pump anymore. And I haven't been doing a whole lot of that. But when I do, and the milk kind of sits in the fridge, the cream rises to the top.
Right.
So you can actually visually see that if you eat a diet that's heavier on the healthy fats, it actually changes the composition of your milk. So I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about that, because you touched on it, but what breast milk is made of and all that kind of stuff.
Oh my gosh. Breast milk is like the most fascinating thing in the world. So in the early stages, and especially how it changes depending on the age of the child, it even changes depending on the gender. There is some research showing that the milk that baby boys get is different from the milk that baby girls get. Isn't that interesting? It's just like there's so much going on that we just have no idea. But in the very early stages, when you first have a baby, it takes a couple days for your mature breast milk to come in. But in those early days, you have a different kind of milk called colostrum, which is very concentrated, very fatty, very calorie dense. And I was surprised. Mine was like almost egg yolk yellow in those early days. Little, you only get a drop or so at a time. I definitely wasn't pumping at that time. You're just kind of trusting with this baby on your breast that like something is happening. But if my milk happened to let down on one side, then sometimes it lets down on the other as well. I'd be like, oh my God, it looks like I have egg yolk on my nipple, but that's colostrum. It's super, super nutrient dense. It's believed to help sort of coat the intestines of a newborn's digestive tract. And it seeds it with good bacteria. There's bacteria in breast milk. So in addition to bacteria being transferred vaginally during delivery, there's also bacteria in breast milk that transfers over. And then when the mature milk comes in, which can vary depending on the woman, but usually between days 2 and 5 or so after having the baby, then it's a little bit thinner. It's sweeter, so it's very rich in lactose, but it also has a variety of, they call them oligosaccharides. They're like long chain sugars or carbohydrates. There's apparently over 200 different types of these carbohydrates in our breast milk that are actually not digested by baby whatsoever. They are there specifically to feed the bacteria in baby's gut and to help set up a healthy microbiome. And so they believe that may be why the digestion and allergy rates and asthma and all these things are so vastly different between breastfed infants and formula-fed infants, is partly because of these crazy cool bacteria feeding carbohydrates that our bodies just make. So, and then the other thing that's really neat about breast milk, I'm just going to go on all sorts of tangents tonight, is that the first milk, other than colostrum, so say you're like a couple weeks in, the first milk that baby gets is higher in water. So it's like to hydrate you. When you think about like how long you can go without eating versus drinking, like you can go a long, long time without calories, but if you get dehydrated, it's like really dangerous. So our bodies know that. And the first milk that comes out is more rich in water. The foremilk has a lot more water. And then the hind milk, which comes in, which, starts emptying towards the end of a feeding session on that specific breast, is higher in fat and higher in calories as well. So it's like it meets the water needs of baby first and then meets the calorie needs of baby second, which is just so fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's so interesting too, because we've talked a lot on our different episodes together about fat and how, like, the role that fat plays in satiating us. And so it's, again, like that experience, and it's not scientific, it's just my experience with my kids.
Right.
But when you have fattier milk, you seem to have babies that are more satisfied, less agitated, because they're actually, and I don't think it's necessarily only the milk, but of course, if you have fatty milk, then the fat soluble vitamins are also in the milk. So then I would wonder if that means the milk is more nutritious as well.
Yeah, I don't know of any studies on that specifically, but that would be my guess as well. And we also have to think, if your diet is providing a lot more of these fats and fat soluble vitamins, your body has to pull less from its own stores, and your body can manufacture less of the saturated fat that's needed and pull from what's taken in from the diet. So I would think so. And I don't know, I'm like an N of one case study, but I just noticed that my milk was it was a lot more yellow. Like sometimes all I've seen is like some friends' breast milk stored in their freezer, and then images that people post of their milk supply online, stuff like that, for women who go back to work and are pumping a lot of milk, which in a way, I'm really envious of, because I'm just not a great pumper. Like, babies are much more efficient at extracting milk than pumps are in general. So that's, not a great indication of supply. However, some of us, myself included, just don't respond well to the pump. It's just this, inanimate object. It's not this cute, cuddly little baby. So I don't pump a ton. I just have like a little freezer stash. But what I've noticed is my milk is a lot more yellow than some of the other breast milk I see. And like you said, there's definitely a pretty thick fatty layer on top. But I'm like all about the fat. So I'm like the person who, my friends will send me pictures of like, oh, did a Lily run at the grocery store, and it's like Kerrygold butter and egg yolks and bacon, and there's usually some veggies in there too, but like all the fatty stuff, they think of me. So I always get a chuckle out of that.
Well, yeah, for sure. And so when I wasn't eating as much fat, sometimes my milk would look kind of bluish. And so I guess the takeaway from this conversation, because you touch on it too, people will say that your diet doesn't impact your breast milk. And it's all like, I mean, it's really great that we live in a time now where we have the sentiment breast is best. So we all kind of get that breast milk is more nutritious and more, manufactured specifically for baby, as you were talking about, of course. So it is the best, most nutritious food for baby. But with that said, if your diet does play a role in the content, and you can actually see the difference in some cases. So I think that's really important. And since we're talking about...
I want to say one more thing, because maybe I'll throw in some like science to this too, since we're just talking like sort of our own anecdotes. And like I said, I don't know of any studies looking at fat content specifically, but we do know that some nutrients, for example, choline, which is a really important substance. It's sort of like a B vitamin, but it was identified after they already named all the B vitamins. So it's called choline, but it's kind of like folate's long lost cousin. It has a really important role in regulating our genes, and has a really important role in brain function specifically, also liver function. It's just super, super good for us. Well, choline needs are at their highest during breastfeeding, actually, even higher than pregnancy needs. And they've shown that choline content of breast milk varies by a woman's diet. So if you're not taking in enough choline, and the two best food sources are egg yolks and liver, then your breast milk won't have enough choline. And that's no bueno for baby, because choline's needed for baby for promoting normal brain development and vision development. The same thing goes for vitamin D. So they've found that you'll hear this a lot, that, and I even heard this in pregnancy from a really dumb doctor who was saying that I had my vitamin D levels monitored throughout my pregnancy out of curiosity and knowing that most women are deficient, and I was living in a very high latitude. So I figured I probably don't have enough, and I didn't. So I needed to supplement more, and it was very good that I got it tested. But when I asked for my third check of my vitamin D levels in my third trimester, they kind of like chuckled, like, do you really want to test this? I mean, you already tested it twice. And I was like, no, I'd really like to know. I also, I want to see where it's at, and I want to ensure that, my vitamin D levels are good for when I'm breastfeeding. And she was like, well, since vitamin D is one of the vitamins that doesn't transfer into breast milk, it doesn't really matter. And I was like, straight up false. That's a total lie. When they've tested breast milk, the average mother who happens to be deficient in vitamin D has breast milk that's deficient in vitamin D. That does not mean that vitamin D is not transferred into breast milk. It means if you're deficient, your breast milk will be deficient as well. We have data showing that women who supplement with extra vitamin D, it's usually 6,000 international units, 6,000 IUs above the traditional 400 IU recommendation, they pass optimal levels of vitamin D to the baby. And if you're really deficient in vitamin D, you might need, more than 6,000 IUs to get your vitamin D levels up to par, and thus make breast milk that has vitamin D levels up to par. But it's just another one of those examples of, something that we have the power to tweak by making sure that we're taking in enough of that vitamin. So vitamin D is a tricky one because diet actually is not our major source of the vitamin. It's sunshine. And if you're at a high latitude, and especially in winter, that's not going to happen. So supplements would be your secondary source. But that's a tricky one because you kind of need to get your blood levels tested to know if you have enough. But nonetheless, if you don't know, the studies have shown it's safe to do 6,000 IUs of vitamin D daily. And then the infants don't need a vitamin D supplement. You know how they usually they suggest breastfeeding mothers supplement their infant with vitamin D? That's because the, average woman who's deficient doesn't make breast milk with enough, and formula is fortified. So they have always told breastfeeding moms to supplement with vitamin D, which seems a little silly to me. If both of you are deficient, you may as well supplement mom and then baby have the vitamin D come in through the breast milk. But, just a little aside there.
Mm-hmm. And 6,000 IUs a day, is that specifically for the recommendation that you would give within pregnancy and breastfeeding, or is that kind of just in general overall if you're living at I live in Canada, so high latitude, here we come.
Right, exactly. And the definition of high latitude, if we're talking really strictly on vitamin D, is quite low. It's like 33 degrees north, which is if you draw a line from like Los Angeles to Atlanta, that's about the 33 degree north parallel. Anything north of that, and then if you're in the southern hemisphere, like anything south of the 33 degrees south parallel, you'd be in the same situation. So the farther you get from the equator, the less vitamin D the less access to vitamin D you have from sunlight for a shorter period of time during the year. Mm-hmm. I hope I'm not confusing you because it gets kind of complicated. But if you're, in the northern part of the US and in Canada, you simply cannot make vitamin D from the sun for all of winter. And the further you go north, the longer that time frame is. It's just the angle of the sun and the UV rays. They have to be of a specific wavelength. So it's kind of complex, but let's just say the vast majority of pregnant women are deficient in vitamin D. So the vast majority of breastfeeding women are deficient as well. The recommendation on 6,000 IUs comes from a specific study that tested using that level of vitamin D. And they used that level of vitamin D in addition to the measly requirement that is currently in our government guidelines, which is 400 IUs. So they gave 6,400 IUs. So it was 6,000 IUs in addition to that measly little amount. But during pregnancy, when they've done studies on vitamin D, the highest they've tested in randomized controlled trials was 4,000 IUs, if that gives you any help in figuring it out. But you really have to have a blood test to know where your levels are at, because some people won't be able to raise their vitamin D levels up high enough if they're already deficient, taking 4,000 IUs in pregnancy or 6,000 IUs postpartum. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it needs to be customized, and you can go to higher levels of supplementation if needed, but you'd want to do that under the direction of a medical practitioner.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like, I mean, if you're living in the Northern Hemisphere, it's safe to say that your vitamin D levels are going to be low, especially because winter is, I mean, I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. Winter is 6 months long. Yes. And so there's no way that you're getting enough vitamin D during that time. And so then having your levels tested and then supplementing accordingly under the direction of a medical care provider who can help you optimize your levels is a best, like, his vitamin D. It's not only good for the baby, it's also good for the mom in so many different ways, and super important for menstrual cycle health. And like, we could do a whole episode on vitamin D. So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yes, we absolutely could.
One of the things that I did want to ask you about, kind of along the same lines in terms of deficiencies. So some women then, after they give birth, do have a harder time making enough milk. So maybe you could speak to that if there is a dietary reason for that, or a nutritional kind of background for that, or even just in general, if you had a client who was having a harder time producing breast milk or felt that she wasn't making enough, what type of dietary suggestions would you make for her to try to, up her supply?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because I bet you every single nursing mom has wondered at some point, am I making enough milk? It's like, it creeps in there no matter how much information you have about understanding how you can tell if baby's getting enough milk or not. That's like always this background weird fear, at least early on. I would say, first of all, if you're wondering if your supply is okay or not, you'd want to meet with a lactation consultant and understand how you can tell if baby's getting enough milk, because a lot of women think that baby's not getting enough milk even when they are. So there's things you can look for, like especially in the output from baby, like the number of wet diapers and the number of dirty diapers per day. There's like a kind of a goal level depending on the age of the baby that they'll often have you pay close attention to in the early months. And then beyond that is looking at baby's weight gain, signals of if they seem to be, satisfied after a feed or still hungry. Although, early on, I think we kind of set up this expectation of moms that, like, oh yeah, like, breastfeed your baby and it's great. And it's like easy, and it's like a full-time job in the early month or 2 or even 3, keeping a baby fed. Like, breastfed babies want to feed all the time. And it's actually really, really good, because the more they feed, the more milk you make. But a lot of women feel like because baby's feeding all the time, then they must not be making enough milk, and they need to supplement. So without getting into like a huge black hole of possibilities, I would say meet with a lactation consultant so you can have a whole range of things assessed before you assume your supply is too low, because oftentimes it's not. Or if it is, a lot of times it's an adjustment between you and baby, how you're doing your feeding thing, more than it is on the nutrition side of things. So with that giant disclaimer out of the way, I will say that staying hydrated is really important. Obviously, breast milk is a liquid, so you're draining some fluids out of your system, and you've got to replace them. And it's surprising how much liquid you actually need. And I think a lot of women fail to get enough fluids in because you're like, when you have a baby and they're like napping on you and you don't want to have to get up to get a glass of water, have to get up and go pee all the time. It's just like, or you don't have somebody there to help you. I mean, all these things just happen where it's hard to drink enough fluids. I would also say that simply getting enough food in volume-wise is important. Like in those first couple weeks, you're probably going to be ravenous, and ravenous for a very good reason, because your body is on overdrive, healing and producing milk. So eat, eat, eat. And I don't recommend any level of restriction on the food front in terms of like portion control on things. Just eat to your satiety, and you might be surprised how much extra room there seems to be in your stomach for food early on. Beyond that, there are some specific foods that can help supposedly increase milk supply. One of them is oats. I'm not like huge on the grains, so I actually never really did oats, and my milk supply is fine. But I think some of the reason that people will go to oats or go to lactation cookies or brewer's yeast and all these different things is that they're simply not getting in enough food that, you add in these extra treats, these extra things that have calories in them, and suddenly it's like, oh, your body is replenished and you have enough and you can, give more via your milk. But other than oatmeal, I have seen some research on oats. I really don't think you need to do anything special. I don't think there's any magical food that if you don't get it, you're suddenly not going to make enough milk, or if you do get it, you're suddenly going to make more. I think a lot of it is just quantity of food and calories and protein and fat, period. So early on, I would say it's just avoid any sort of restrictive eating, especially if you're worried about getting back in your pre-pregnancy genes or whatever. Like, in my opinion, feeding baby is far more important than getting your figure back. And a lot of times, if you cut back on calories, your supply drops. And a lot of women notice that, especially women who pump and do other things. So the early months postpartum is not the time to go on a diet. It's the time to replenish, like big time, for your body and for baby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I just think that, well, I think we talked about that a little bit as well. Maybe it was just you and I, or maybe it was on the podcast, but that crazy expectation for women to somehow give birth to a human being and then try to get this pre-pregnancy body thing. And to be honest, as a mom, the whole concept of pre-pregnancy body, I find it actually offensive, because before pregnancy, I didn't have a baby. So I don't want to go back to this time when I didn't have a baby. I had one. So the pre-pregnancy body is actually gone, because I have actually, it's interesting, right? You become a mother, you physically change, but you also change to your mom now. So I guess just to throw that out there, not to go on a huge tangent about it, but I think that it's really unfortunate that is the goal of so many women. But with that being said, I mean, we all want to feel good in our bodies. Maybe this is a good time to speak to this whole concept that breastfeeding makes you skinny, or that when you breastfeed, the baby will suck out all the fat and you'll lose the weight.
I know.
Taboo.
In some ways, I kind of feel bad, because I've used that in practice as like, it's like one of those extra, what tools in our toolbox can we like throw at this woman who's like, if you breastfeed your baby, you're going to lose the pregnancy weight faster. And in some ways, if we're looking at it from like a calories in, calorie out kind of a thing, if breastfeeding is burning an additional 500 calories per day without you doing anything, like you're sitting on the couch feeding baby and you are burning an additional 500 calories, like, whoa. But what we forget is that there's a lot of hormonal things going on in the body, and you're not going to be active in the same ways that you were active before, at least hopefully no time soon after having a baby. And your eating is different, for better or for worse. A lot of women just don't lose the pregnancy weight really fast, and I wish we would sort of shift our cultural expectations of women postpartum, because I feel like there are 1,000 things working against you to make you feel like you're doing a bad job. There's like, well, they said baby should sleep through the night. Oh crap, baby's not sleeping through the night. Oh, I don't know if like I'm making enough milk because baby seems fussy. Oh, I can't fit in my pregnancy jeans, and it's already been, it's been 2 months or 3 months or 4 months that I have baby. But like, there's just all of these weird expectations that are thrown upon us, which are ridiculous.
And you read a couple books, and your baby's supposed to be on a schedule, so you're supposed to feed your baby every 3 hours, and that it just doesn't make sense. You can stress yourself out with that concept, because breastfeeding babies will eat when they want to eat, and it's not every 3 hours.
Oh, heck no. I mean, I'm almost 8 months out, and sometimes I don't get 3-hour breaks between nursing sessions. It is, and there's still cluster feeding times where baby wants to eat. It seems like back to back. But I think probably the most helpful thing, I'm going on a total tangent, but I'm going to go here anyways. The most helpful thing for me was spending time with other new moms, and not just like, oh, we meet up for dinner every once in a while, but like seeing people in their house as baby grows, and sort of understanding like, okay, when you are a nursing mom with a young infant, they are going to want to nurse all the time, all the time. Yeah. Like my sister came and visited me 3 months postpartum. She doesn't have any kids. And she was like, man, he's just eating all the time. I'm like, yeah, tell me about it. It's like, it's around the clock, but that's normal. And we set up this weird expectation that like babies are going to be on a schedule, or they're only going to eat every 3 hours, or, and it's just dumb. I mean, I think to be a successful nursing mom and to truly, keep your supply up long term, like if you want to make it to 6 months and beyond, I think you really do need to be feeding on demand, and feeding on demand means being tied down with a baby attached to you for a long time. And it's just with our crazy maternity leave or lack thereof and all this stuff going on, and all these ridiculous expectations on you going back to your workout habits and losing all the weight and all this stuff happening, it's just everything is working against you. So if I can give any, any support or any extra, encouragement to moms who are like early on and kind of in the thick of it, like you do get your like time and space like back to yourself. But it takes time. Even like 6 months out, I like left baby with my husband and went out and like ran errands by myself. And I was like, I think I went like 4 hours between a nursing session. I was like, this might be a record for middle of the day. And like baby didn't get a bottle at home. Like he was fine. I was like, whoa, like this is so much time, but that's after, months and months of being in the thick of it and like feeding a baby constantly. So anyways, it's crazy the type of expectations that are thrown at us.
Yeah, no, breastfeeding is definitely, it's just like you said. And I think sometimes if you choose to breastfeed and you want to breastfeed, it is a big time commitment, and people around you, if they either have not been around somebody who breastfeeds, don't have children of their own, haven't breastfed themselves, or they bottle fed their own kids, like I had times where good friends of mine would, I would be with my baby, feeding him or whatever, and I'd just be talking to him a little bit. Oh, you done, sweetheart? Oh, do you want some more? Just how you do. And
Right.
my girlfriend, who's only bottle fed all her kids, was just like, oh my goodness, like I couldn't handle that. Like you just give them a bottle and you know how much it is and you measure it and it's good. So I think that there's often that clash of, like people asking you, well, that seems like a lot of work and da da da. Maybe they don't understand. So I think there's a lot of different challenges that breastfeeding moms face.
There are.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I actually kind of felt the opposite in some ways. Like being such like a mindful eater, I was always like, and the times when I would pump and need to go somewhere and leave baby with somebody, it was like, oh gosh, how do I know that I like left the right amount of milk? Like how do I know how much he drinks in one sitting? Like, I don't know. And it's probably different all the time. Just like we all sit down to meals and we all eat different amounts at different times. And sometimes you want a snack and sometimes you just want to drink. And because breast milk is like fluid and food all in one, like how the heck do I know like what he needs? And I found it really stressful to know if that bottle was enough. So it's funny. It's really funny. But, formula is also a challenge because in some ways, I think some of our norms about babies' schedules and sleep schedules and all of those things were created or studied in the time when breastfeeding rates were at their lowest. So some of these expectations about babies' sleep habits and how long they should go between feedings and schedules and all of those things come from that time period. And breast milk is the original food for baby. And so it digests really well, but it digests faster than formula. So they're often eating more often rather than taking, a large bottle of formula with longer spans of time between it. But I think like the biggest time period that is like a frustration is probably in the first like 4 to 5 months. I think that's when breastfeeding is like the most demanding. And then from there, the feeds space out so much more that you kind of, I don't know, I feel like you kind of get your life back.
Well,
am I allowed to say that?
Yeah. Well, you probably had that moment where you realize that you are the source of your baby's nutrition. So if you choose to breastfeed, like you realize at some point that you are it, like you are the buffet table. And there's nothing else to offer. Like it's all you. It's all you. And then you look at your baby and you see your baby growing and you just think to yourself, like, where did all of that come from? Like you have this chubby baby, they've got these beautiful rolls and you're just like, where did all of that come from? So I think it's, it's a really interesting thing. And I wanted to kind of touch on, we touched on so many important topics and one of them is kind of that weight issue and some women do breastfeed and they find that I have friends that are skinnier than they were before they got pregnant. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't necessarily only the breastfeeding. I had a friend who, because she was at home, because in Canada we have a year maternity leave with her son, she was also walking. She would take, and he wasn't really napping at home. So they were walking every day for long periods of time because that's the only time he would sleep. And so like it was a kind of a combination of a different thing. Whereas other women find that it's a lot harder to kick the baby weight even when they're breastfeeding, and they'll say, well, that did make a difference for me. And so one of the things we've talked about a lot is hunger, and just how we talked about that at the beginning of the show, how ridiculously hungry you can be. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love to talk about, because I completely agree with you. I don't think it's a good idea at all when you're breastfeeding. It's not even reasonable or realistic to think that you're going to limit your portions because you're hungry for a reason. But I think that the only thing you can control in a sense is like what's in your house. And so I remember when I was pregnant, people would say things like, you should try to make food and put them in the freezer, like make whatever lasagna or whatever it is that's easy that you can freeze, that you have it. And that kind of practical advice, although all the advice you get can feel really annoying, because I'm
Oh
sure
yeah.
you've experienced that. But some of the practical advice, it's actually true. So for someone who's listening who is pregnant and they are thinking about this and they're like, how do I prepare then for when the baby comes? So what are some of the suggestions for foods to have on hand that are nutritious, so nutrient dense, meeting those needs that we have not only for our own nutrition, but for our baby's nutrition, but also foods that are going to be satisfying. Because, like when you're super hungry, you typically go for the carbs, but they don't satisfy us for long.
Right, right. Yeah, and that was actually kind of interesting for me early postpartum. I do well on sort of like a moderately lower carb diet, so like not a ton of grains and not a ton of sugar and just like meals that are much heavier on like the meat or fish and vegetables and then cooked in a whole bunch of fat, of course. And I found I was just so hungry I was just eating everything. So any like concern about over consuming carbohydrates, I just completely ignored because I was starving and I was one of those people that dropped the weight really fast and like actually needed to eat extra. So I wasn't like dropping too much weight. Like I was like your friend that you were describing. But I would say one of the most helpful things in terms of planning for baby, I like didn't do the freezer meal thing all that well, but I had some awesome friends that arranged a meal train where every day for the first 2 weeks, somebody brought me dinner, brought me and my husband dinner. And that was amazing because they usually brought enough for dinner and some leftovers for the next day. So for most of the time, I had breakfast and lunch lunch and dinner taken care of. And and the only thing that I did was, if you have any dietary restrictions, like I have a sensitivity to wheat, so I avoid it. I just noted that. And then most people brought pretty good stuff. The only thing I had to do was, I think because they know that I'm a dietitian, and some of these people weren't like really, really close friends. It was like a whole community of people brought stuff. I think they tried to make things like really healthy. So we got a lot of like plain steamed broccoli, which is always my example of like health food gone wrong. It's like the most unflavorful, unsatisfying way to make broccoli. So we did a lot of like adding butter and cheese onto like to the things that people brought because I can't subsist on like boneless, skinless chicken breasts and steamed plain broccoli and brown rice. Like that just, I need like lots more calories and lots more fat in there. So I did make some adjustments that way, but that were helpful for me. I did have some things frozen. I had made some chili, which was super delicious. And that's an easy thing to sneak liver into as well. If people are kind of like about organ meats. Like I said, liver is just incredibly nutrient dense. It has a ton of choline for you and for baby's brain development, lots of iron. So if you happen to lose a lot of blood during childbirth, even if you don't lose a lot of blood, you still lose some and you're still exhausted and possibly anemic. So like hiding liver or having red meat or something is really good. So chili is awesome because you have the red meat. I sneak some liver in there. I have tomatoes in there, which are acidic and help you absorb the iron. And it's just really good. So I had some of that frozen. We did meatloaf. Like, seriously, I was just a huge carnivore. Like, I wanted to eat a whole cow. But we did meatloaf, which we also hide liver in. I would do big breakfasts, like a couple eggs and bacon and like sweet potatoes and like just a bunch of stuff. Anyways, that's if you have like help. Yeah. Either you can prep ahead of time and have some of those things on hand, or you have people bringing you meals. And I highly, highly recommend the meal train thing. That was by far the most helpful thing postpartum ever. Far more helpful than any of the silly baby gifts and cute onesies and all that stuff. Like that stuff's great, but what you really need is like an extra set of hands and food on the ready.
You could just make a rule that when you come to visit baby, just say, bring food. And you can laugh and make a joke of it, but you're actually serious.
No, and it was so great when people would call before they were coming over, like, I'm bringing this, do you need anything else? Or I'm stopping at, whatever it's called, store, do you need something? And it was great. Sometimes people would be like, I'm stopping at the smoothie place. You want a smoothie? I'm like, so not a smoothie person, but I'm like, yes, bring me home.
Yeah, and side note, say yes. So when someone calls you and asks you if you need something, say yes. And if you don't know, say, okay, let me think for a second and then figure something out, because you do need stuff.
Absolutely. The one thing I will say that's really helpful is, in terms of food, think about things that you can easily eat with one hand, because a lot of times you won't have two hands. Like, inevitably, dinner would be ready and baby would want to nurse again. It was like, really?
On cue. How did you know?
Sleeping all peacefully, and then it's like the meal's ready, and like it just always wake up and always want to eat right then. So a lot of times I was nursing while eating. And so sometimes I need to put like a little napkin over baby so I don't drop things. But meals that you can eat easily with one hand, things that balance on a fork quite well, or are like one-handed portable things, are helpful. I also had like snack stations around the house. So there was like glasses of water everywhere. I was doing like mother's milk tea. You talked about things to help milk. There's some, helpful herbs in certain mother's milk tea combinations that supposedly can help. Who knows? I had dried fruit and nuts, cheese, and gluten-free crackers, like easy grab-and-go things like beef jerky, like any of those sort of snacks I would have out with me while I was nursing. Like, pretty much if baby was eating, I was eating and also drinking water or tea or something. So maybe thinking about things that are portable. I know some people go all hog wild, like prepping all these snacks, and people get that nesting bug like crazy during pregnancy. I just didn't. And so I kind of like scrounged together the snacks after the fact. But if I had planned ahead, I probably would have created some homemade yummy energy bar type things that would have been really helpful.
Well, I found that with my youngest, we had access to raw milk. So I had found a local farm. I've talked about this before. And so having that like whole milk with the fat, that thick layer of fat on it. And I don't know, that was a really easy go-to snack for me, because I just had to go to the fridge and pour it into a glass. And then obviously it's not a meal, but it was definitely helpful throughout the day to have that, and then that also helps me get the fat that I need and the vitamin content, and to make me feel more satisfied, even to have a snack and then have that with it. But then I do pretty good on milk, and I know not everybody does, but that's just something I thought I'd throw in there too.
I should add to that giant breakfast that I had. I'm a tea person, and so I do tea and then like a ginormous splash of heavy cream in my tea. So it's kind of like English style. You know how they usually put milk in their black tea, but like no sugar, just like heavy cream. Nice. So again, trying to just stay satisfied and stay hydrated. It's a lot of work.
No, for sure. And we've covered so much today. I think the only other, and it's too kind of big of a topic to touch on, but a lot of moms then struggle with postpartum depression. I think there's a lot of different reasons for why that is. And I've touched on it in the show, where if you are not super healthy going into pregnancy, or you have certain challenges that you're facing hormonally or otherwise, and then you get pregnant on top of that, that kind of sets you up for, to maybe a higher chance of having issues if you weren't, even what we talked about with regards to nutrient deficiencies. If a woman is facing postpartum depression, or she finds that that's something that she's struggling with, is it basically the same dietary guidelines, or is there anything in particular that she would want to focus on in terms of her diet?
Specifically for helping you feel better, definitely fat is really important. Unless you have an issue with eggs, I highly would recommend eating eggs regularly, the whole eggs with the yolk, because that choline is incredibly nourishing for the brain. The vitamin D that we talked about also plays a role in how well you're feeling postpartum. And it's normal to have some baby blues. Like I said, it's kind of like your world is flipped upside down with a baby. And so it's normal to have some, lows, but if it's sticking around and lingering for a long time, that's when you really want to get serious about things and seek help. But one of the nutrients they found that can actually prevent postpartum depression is getting your vitamin D levels up to par during pregnancy, and you could still do it postpartum. So that would be a useful thing to bring up at your doctor's visit, like your postpartum checkup. And also omega-3s. So the DHA that you find in like wild Alaskan salmon or in fish oil supplements, that's also really helpful for the brain. But I don't think postpartum depression is purely a nutritional thing. So I would say seek help for sure. I think connecting with other moms of babies is really, really helpful. Probably the most helpful thing, because our culture is not very baby friendly in general. And it takes more than just some extra family members here and there stopping by to help out. Like you need to find your groove in this new normal. And I think finding friends, and it's hard to make mom friends, but making the effort to meet other moms, maybe if you took a birthing class or something while you were pregnant, that's a really good way to meet moms who are due it around the same time as you. But talking to other women who are also in the thick of it helps you get a new perspective on things. And so that can be really helpful as well. But yeah, you just want to seek help, talk to somebody about it, and find what resources are available in your area.
And yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is that it's exactly what you said, how important it is to talk to other moms, but never think that it's just you. Postpartum depression has some really messed up symptoms. So you feel like that you're a bad person and you feel like there's something wrong with you. If you have kind of those intrusive thoughts, or, every second of motherhood isn't amazing. And I think that when you're trying to get pregnant, especially if it was a real struggle to get pregnant, it sets up this weird perfection image. I mean, just look on your Facebook feed and go and check out all the baby pictures. It's this lovely, pretty, flowery, perfect picture. Well, the baby was sleeping in the picture, and the picture was taken within that honeymoon phase, the first, say, 2 to 3 weeks afterwards, where they just sleep, and it's super cute. Every moment of motherhood isn't amazing. It's really not. And motherhood is amazing, but every moment of it isn't. And so never think that you're the only one that ever thought like, oh, why did he wake up so early, or whatever it is, even if it's like a bad thought. If you find yourself having super bad, creepy thoughts, that's related to postpartum depression. So make sure to seek support. Just never think that you're the only one that ever had those thoughts, and don't be hard on yourself, but just try to reach out for help if you find that it's like all-consuming.
And there's also, I think there's this weird stigma against postpartum depression where, like, when we think of it, we think of what's actually postpartum psychosis. So we think of the moms who like drown their baby or something like that. And that's actually, if you're getting thoughts that are telling you to harm your baby, that is like a far more serious thing than postpartum depression. And it's rare. I think a lot of postpartum depression is just more like, sometimes you're just in a little bit of a lull or a rut, or, oh my gosh, this is my day again, or holy cow, I can never leave my house by myself ever again. I think even those of us who wouldn't think of ourselves as having postpartum depression, like, we all have bad days as moms, and I think we really need to like normalize the ups and downs that go along with motherhood. Not to downplay legitimate postpartum depression, because sometimes you do need like much more than the resources I'm talking about, but there's a lot of just ups and downs that go with it, and just to kind of learn to ride the waves of it and not try to be perfect and do everything just right. It's just sort of like, stay off Google.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like how I've talked about, it's not a good example, but I'll use it. But it's like how I've talked about miscarriage. So if you have a miscarriage and then you talk about it, all of a sudden you discover that all these people you know have had one too. But before you had one, you had no idea that like 6 of your friends had a miscarriage. Like you just had like, and it's mind-boggling. And so it's the same kind of thing when you have a baby where your friends with children, they didn't tell you all the stuff. Like they didn't sit you down and tell you all of the things. And there's a lot of things that they're not telling you. So yeah, you're not the only one. Whatever it is, whether you have a weird thing, a weird color of something postpartum, if you're bleeding postpartum, or whether you know what I mean? Like all that stuff no one talks about. If you have some like hugely painful breasts, like painful if breastfeeding, because we've talked a lot about breastfeeding. Obviously that was the topic of the day, but we didn't get into the hard stuff because that wasn't what today's show was about. But breastfeeding also is not a walk in the park for every woman. And for some women it's just incredibly difficult. So there's a lot of things. So I guess, hopefully you can take that from this show whatever it is, you're not the only one. And as soon as you start talking about it, all of a sudden you'll be like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that my best friend had this problem with her first child because she just didn't tell you. She was busy dealing with it.
Speaking of breastfeeding challenges early on, I only have one friend I can think of who had like 0 challenges with breastfeeding. Everybody else, like something comes up, oh yeah, that happened. Oh yeah, that. It's like, and those early weeks, like that first month, I think is by far the hardest with breastfeeding. Like going through it personally, I was like, man, if I wasn't so damn stubborn about this, I can see why women choose to do formula. Like this is hard. Like there are definite hard periods in the breastfeeding relationship. Now it's like so easy and so rewarding. Like I would never have done anything different. But in like those first couple weeks when your breasts are engorged and your nipples are tired of being suckled on 24/7, you know what I mean? It's like, will this ever end? This is so challenging. But it's one of those things, similar to postpartum depression. The sooner you reach out for help on those things, the better, particularly with breastfeeding challenges in the early stages. Gosh, we could do a whole show on that alone. But there are like 1,000 things that can possibly happen with breastfeeding early on. And it's really, really helpful to have a good lactation consultant to meet with. It's like the most invaluable thing in the world.
Well, and it's with breastfeeding, when you have challenges, because I had a really hard, challenging time. So maybe I'll do an episode at some point where I talk about that and share a little bit more about that. But it's acute. So it's like you need help that day. That's the thing with breastfeeding. So your baby has to eat like 12 times a day in the first couple of weeks. And so if every time they go on the breast, it's like killing, because like for me, it was like razor blade, like it's like so painful, like you can't even explain it. And so then, but your baby has to eat like 12 times a day. So the lactation consultant thing, it's like, you need them yesterday. They need to come to your house today because that's how acute it is. But we could talk about this forever because of course we're both in that zone. We both have babies at home and they're still breastfeeding, and I'll kind of bring it to a close here, but I really appreciate you, Lily, sharing your experiences as well from your own journey now that you're a new mom. And I think it's really helpful for women to talk about these things and to hear about the challenges other women face, so you don't feel like you're alone, or you don't feel like you're the only one going through these things, because you're not. I'll just say that. You are not the only one.
I agree wholeheartedly.
So, I mean, I think one of the questions that I usually ask, I feel like we just covered it, but just in case there's something else you wanted to say, what is the biggest takeaway that you want our listeners to take away from our conversation today?
Okay. Your breast milk is, no matter what, the best food for a baby. No matter what you're eating, it is the most nutritious thing for your baby to have. If you want to make it that much better, eat really good quality food. Focus on quality food. So quality eggs at your breakfast and quality meat in that meatloaf and quality vegetables and fruits, whatever you get locally. And your breast milk will be even that much better. And I'll stop there.
Awesome. Well, I will stop there. No more questions for today. But I just want to thank you so much for coming back on the show, Lily. Fourth time to charm. It's crazy. Like you and I, we could literally just talk and talk and talk. Like if you add it up, that's like 4.5 hours of us talking on the show so far.
I know.
And every time there's so many different topics and so many different aspects. So I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and wisdom with the audience, and especially on breastfeeding, because it's not something that I've covered a whole lot on the show. And so I'm really happy that we had an opportunity to do that today.
Yeah, likewise. And I'll be back for a 5th time, not too long.
Yes. Well, there's always more to cover, and I love it. So for our listeners then who have not, maybe this is the first time they're tuning in and the first time I'm having an opportunity to hear from you, where can they go for more information about you?
Sure. You can go 2 places. My main website is pilatesnutritionist.com, and that has my blog. Or you can go to, if you're interested in my work on gestational diabetes, which we didn't talk about today, you can go to realfood4gd.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lily. It's been awesome as usual. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/126. I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Lily. It was, well, you can tell that I love having Lily on the show because I've had her on the show 4 times. I think this is our 4th interview together. And so I love that even though the underlying aspect of our conversation is real food, I love how it applies to so many different situations specifically. I really enjoyed our conversation today about breastfeeding and how important diet is for breastfeeding. I think it's really interesting, the sentiment that, well, you know, the baby will get what he or she needs regardless. It's a really important thing to remember that it does matter what we eat. And not to become obsessive about it, but just to know that the more nutrient rich we can make our diet, then the more nutrient rich our breast milk is going to be. And from my own experience, I saw the difference firsthand with my own 2 eyes. I was eating in a bit of a different way when I had my oldest son. And at that point, I was not drinking bone broth regularly. I was not eating liver regularly. I didn't have access to raw milk. And I remember when I would pump my breast milk, sometimes it would look so thin and kind of pale. It would look bluish sometimes, versus when I had my youngest son now, where when I first started breastfeeding, I have to admit I haven't pumped for maybe a year, but in those first couple months I did pump on occasion. And when I pumped, first of all, I had way more milk. I just had a ridiculously heavy supply this time versus the first time, where I always had enough, but it's just very obviously that I had a lot more this time in terms of quantity, which could be related to the hormonal differences, who knows, but I had more. And also the quality of the milk, you could see it. There was a thick layer of fat on the top. This time around, I had access to raw milk. I was eating regularly organ meats, liver. When I was going into labor, the first thing I did was throw on some bones, and I made bone broth, and I was eating the bone marrow, and it was just a completely different experience this time. I really felt nourished, and I could feel the difference. I had more energy. I was able to cope a little bit better, and I really believe that was because I was throwing all of the nutrition at my body that I could possibly handle. And you better believe that I could see the difference in my breast milk, because the first time around, I definitely didn't have like half an inch of fat at the top that would collect when I put the milk in the fridge. So just something to consider. And I'm really glad that Lily and I were able to have that conversation today. And I hope that you did find it beneficial and helpful and enlightening. And the candid discussion as well about how your appetite can change during that time and how important it is to have meals ready. It doesn't mean that it's important for you to cook them. You could, if you can find ways or encourage friends who are visiting to bring meals, or and sometimes you don't have to ask for that to happen, but sometimes you do. And so knowing that the people in your life who wanted to come by to see the baby, they're going to ask you, do you need anything? Can I bring anything? And you're going to say yes. Could you bring us some food? because we're really hungry. We haven't had a chance to cook today. So make sure that you're asking for the things that you need so that you can really be nourished and taken care of during the most critical time after the baby is born, when you really do need it the most. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you who have been leaving reviews. It is incredible. There are over 100 5-star reviews on the US iTunes, and I just couldn't be more thrilled. I'm so happy that the podcast has been getting out there. It's been getting lots of exposure, and all of the reviews, all of the sharing, when you share episodes with your friends, when you share the podcast on social media, when you talk about it and tell your friends about it and tell your clients about it and tell, shout it from the rooftops. I really appreciate it because it really does make a difference. And I can see the growth that's been happening over the last year and 2 years. I can tell you that I have, easily 10 times as many people tuning into the podcast as I did when I first started. And that is really because of you. And I couldn't be more thankful for all of you. And I've said this before on the podcast, but one of the number one things that you tell me when you reach out to me in emails and on social media is really that all women need to know this. Like, why doesn't everybody know this? And so I need your help to share this with everybody, because that's why I do this, because I do believe everyone needs to know it. And it's not in the schools yet. So we need to make that happen. So I need your help to share this with as many women as possible. And so I just want to thank you for doing that and supporting me in that, because without you, I wouldn't be getting the exposure that I'm getting. I wouldn't be reaching new women every day. And so I'm so appreciative of all of you for helping me in my quest to bring this knowledge to everybody, because everybody does need to know it. Also, along that same vein, if you do have an idea for a podcast episode or a guest suggestion, make sure to send me an email at info@fertilityfriday.com. I definitely do take the feedback, and I have had a number of guests on the show just as a result of your requesting them. Because believe it or not, there are so many amazing health professionals that I've never heard of. And so I really need your support in helping me get the best people on the show. And so thank you again for everything that you do to support me and to support the show. I appreciate it so much. For those of you who are wanting more information about how to work with me one-on-one, go over to fertilityfriday.com/work with me for more information about my one-on-one programs as well as my group program. And if you're looking for a one-time session, if you're more of an experienced charter and you know that you don't really need a full program, but you do want some support in interpreting your chart, make sure to check out my strategy sessions, which you'll see on my Work With Me page. So thank you again for hanging out with me today, for taking your most valuable resource, your time, and spending it with me. I appreciate you so much for doing that. And so whether you're going for a walk, or if you're taking me on your commute to work, or if you are going for a run or walking the dog, doing laundry or cooking, whatever it is that you're doing, thank you so much for letting me be part of your day. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.